a U.S. senator destroyed by blackmail.
He was not bound by the truth or by facts.
The country's most outrageous political demagogue ascending toward the peak of American power.
Millions upon millions of devoted followers.
This is a story of heroes willing to face down tyranny and the risk to the country if they fail.
Rachel Maddow presents Ultra, Season 2 of the chart-topping original podcast. Listen now on Amazon Music.
Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in the East. The decision by the Supreme Court that now, after yesterday, American presidents can legally function as kings is a clarifying moment for everyone in what friend of the show Sarah Longwell describes as the single largest voting coalition in American politics. And that would be the anti-Trump voters, our coalition. Now, the dangers of a second Trump term loom larger than at any other moment that has come before this. Now that the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court has made it clear and made it official that the judiciary will not stand in the way of Donald Trump's autocratic intentions. And the plans by Trump and his allies are not rumors, they're not innuendo, they're not left-wing delusions, they're not even based on Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporting on conversations happening behind closed doors. They're out in the public. They're laid out for everyone to see. Trump's promise to weaponize the Justice Department and the justice system is broadcast nearly daily by Trump himself. Just hours before the court's ruling in Trump versus the United States, Trump called for more than 12 of his critics to be imprisoned. On that, the Times reports this, quote, one post that he circulated on Sunday singled out Liz Cheney and called for her to be prosecuted by a type of military court reserved for enemy combatants and war criminals. A separate post included photos of 15 former and current elected officials that said in all capital letters, quote, they should be going to jail on Monday, not Steve Bannon. Those officials included Mr. Biden, Ms. Harris, Mr. Pence, Mr. Schumer, and Mr. McConnell, the top leaders in the Senate, and Representative Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker. Now, to really get our arms around how much more power a reelected, return to the White House, Donald Trump, would have to act on those tweets and those threats, we only have to look back to what he tried to do in his first term. His first term, he was largely stopped or slowed by his own White House attorneys. We know that back in 2018, his White House counsel at the time, Don McGahn, had to dissuade Trump from ordering Hillary Clinton and Jim Comey to be prosecuted. Here's what the New York Times reported at the time, quote, Donald McGahn rebuffed the president, saying that he had no authority to order a prosecution. McGahn said that while he could request an investigation, that too could prompt accusations of abuse of power. To underscore his point, McGahn had White House lawyers write a memo for Mr. Trump warning that if he asked law enforcement to investigate his rivals, he could face a range of consequences, including possible impeachment. Now, fast forward just a few years, it felt like 13 years. White House attorneys, Pat Cipollone and Eric Hirschman, stood in the way from the January 6 hearings, it sounds like physically at some point, to block Trump's coup attempt. They warned of the legal peril should Trump barrel ahead with trying to overturn an election he lost. So now consider how he woke up today. Not just feeling empowered, but being empowered, and how he would feel if reelected, knowing that the 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court, 3 of whom he handpicked, have ruled that presidents have, quote, absolute immunity for anything deemed a core constitutional function and the presumption of immunity for anything else that can be deemed an official act. One expert telling the Washington Post this, quote, if a future president sitting in the Oval Office were to want to commit crimes up to and including subverting an election or remaining in power against the will of the American people, this opinion in my mind could provide a roadmap for that. Yesterday's decision by the Supreme Court leaves the American people with only one option. We're down to one option, guys. No one's coming to save us. And that is this, imposing political accountability for the man who tried to overturn the election and now seeks to wreck the pillars of our democracy. Here's how President Joe Biden put it last night.
The American people have to render a judgment about Donald Trump's behavior. The American people must decide whether Donald Trump's assault on our democracy on January 6th makes him unfit for public office in the highest office in the land. The American people must decide if Trump's embrace of violence to preserve his power is acceptable. Perhaps most importantly, the American people must decide if they want to entrust the president once again, the presidency, to Donald Trump, now knowing he'll be even more emboldened to do whatever he pleases whenever he wants to do it.
What the Supreme Court's ruling on immunity means for the choice between democracy and autocracy facing every voter in this country in the 2024 presidential election is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. National investigative reporter for The Washington Post, Carol Leonnig, is back with us. Plus, former U.S. Attorney, MSNBC legal analyst Barbara McQuade is here. Former Republican Congressman and MSNBC political analyst David Jolly is back with us. Carol Leonnig, a lot of this is your body of reporting from the great books you wrote with the great Phil Rucker. A lot of it is ground that we covered on the show as it was happening. But when you re-examine Trump's affinity for criminal acts and his constant sort of cognizance of the power of the pardon for himself and the people he was asking to engage in conduct, that even he had this reptilian sense to where he might be criminal. How do you sort of reevaluate some of the biggest crises you covered in light of the Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, Nicolle, I'm so glad you hearkened back to some of that reporting, both by the Times and the Washington Post and myself and Phil, because to me, there were moments where Donald Trump was looking to protect himself despite his own instincts about what he wanted to do. He listened to Don McGahn, his White House counsel, even though he was pounding the table at the time in frustration when he wanted to have Jim Comey, his former FBI director, investigated and imprisoned, when he wanted Hillary Clinton, one of his nemesis, to be also investigated and hopefully, in his view, convicted in a trial. It seems to me that all of those guardrails that we talked about as being at least a delaying mechanism, or in some cases an actual stop, those are now lifted entirely. The immunity decision by the 6-3 decision of the Supreme Court basically says that the burden is dramatically on the prosecutor to show how these are not official acts. The president, former President Donald Trump, but back in 2019 and 2020, wanted to accomplish some things at the border. In addition to weaponizing his Justice Department, which he also sought to do but held back from, he also wanted to show how tough he was on the border. And when his Secretary of Homeland Security said, "What you're asking me to do is illegal, I cannot bar people from seeking asylum in this country," the president's reaction was, "Well, I'll just pardon you. Go ahead and do it." Now, those people did not want to face criminal liability. They'll have less arguing with Donald Trump in the future. They'll have less opportunity to say this is criminal, because it's a really open question. If the president wants to achieve something, including hanging on to power, showing that he's tough, taking out a rival that he believes or can argue is a national security threat, who's going to stop him exactly? What threat faces him? And what argument can his secretaries of defense, Homeland Security, or Justice make to him? There's very little left.
You know, I was also thinking of all the fantastic reporting about the period around the protests after the murder of George Floyd. And some of the most incredible things that came out were about Defense Secretary Mark Esper and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley pushing back against Stephen Miller's suggestion to use the Insurrection Act. I mean, some of the backstops against Trump's impulses, Carol, were that things were, what the military leaders would say is we wouldn't follow an illegal order. I mean, this sort of recasts what is an illegal order if a president has absolute immunity for criminal acts that he deems official.
Yes, as Justice Jackson asked in oral arguments, and Sotomayor as well. Well, couldn't SEAL Team 6 be instructed by the president on his argument that it's protective of national security to execute a rival? What would stop that exactly? And let's be clear, Nicolle, you've brought a real spotlight to this. Donald Trump has said that former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, who rebutted and blocked Trump from some of his worst instincts in his final year in the presidency when he was trying to hold power, trying to use the military to that end. Trump has said that Milley would normally face potential execution for his quote unquote treason against the Trump administration. Now, that all sounds insane, right, to anybody who understands the rule of law. But that's been Donald Trump's argument. And if he can say, I now, as the newly reelected 46th president of the United States, believe that the former chairman is a danger and a threat to this country. So how is that not an official act if he commands SEAL Team 6 to do it?
I also want to retread some history with you, Barbara McQuade. I mean, this is out today in the Washington Post. Former Nixon White House counsel John Dean said Monday that had the court's ruling been enforced in the early 1970s, history could have turned out very differently. Quote, as I looked at it, I realized Richard Nixon would have had a pass because the evidence against him was based on official acts the Supreme Court has deemed immune from prosecution. You can almost erect an alternate history, right? I mean, this is an extraordinary fork in the road for everyone in this country, everyone who I think if they knew much about, or they knew a lot, or they knew a little about the Constitution, they knew that one of our values was that no one was above the rule of law. After yesterday, one person is, the American president.
Yeah, and when the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, what they're saying is this is what it said all along. This is what the founding fathers meant when they wrote this more than 200 years ago. That certainly wasn't the understanding, however, during the Watergate era. As you know, Nicolle, a big part of that case was the allegations that Richard Nixon had ordered the CIA to try to dissuade the FBI from investigating the burglary at the Watergate office building. That is absolutely an official act. And so under today's standard, the opinion decided yesterday, not only could President Nixon not have been charged for that order, you couldn't even use that as evidence. And so it really calls into question the consistency between yesterday's decision and the U.S. versus Nixon case, where the tapes were ordered to be turned over. If Nixon couldn't be charged with the crime, then how can you force him to turn over evidence of a crime that cannot be prosecuted? It really does, I think, put into stark relief just how questionable yesterday's decision really is. One of my least favorite portions of the opinion is where Chief Justice Roberts accuses the dissenters of engaging in fear-mongering, pointing out that as the dissenters do, that someone could order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a rival or accept a bribe in exchange for a pardon. But what he never says is that it's not true. He just says that these are extreme hypotheticals. But today, really, there is nothing that would mean that a president would be charged with a crime if he were to engage in that behavior. And I think the Watergate example really brings home what a stark difference this is in our understanding of how the Constitution has worked for these 200-some years.
David Jolly, a lot of people that I know and people that I don't, beloved viewers of this program, I saw people expressing fear. I'm afraid of what the court ushered in, but my colleague Rachel Maddow, as she is beloved for doing, had sort of cut right to the crux of this. Let me play that for you right now.
The rule of law is supposed to constrain the ruler. And the Supreme Court just undid that. And it's binding. And it's now the way our country is structured. And the only way out of this, the only fix to this, there's no fix to this that involves impeaching Supreme Court justices. There's no fix to this that involves a new argument or a new case. The only fix to this is to put someone in the White House from here on out who will not abuse the absolutely tyrannical power they have just been legally granted in perpetuity.
Do you agree with that? And what does that mean?
Yeah, I do. Look, Barb talked about the founders, and I think the founders did not envision a raw criminal or someone that would be willing to engage in unlawful behavior, truly unlawful behavior, occupying what appeared to be an office of great honor. And I think where the Chief Justice got it wrong, and Rachel gets it right, is it is plausible to imagine these scenarios. Look, I, as an attorney, come down, for those who followed the live breaking news yesterday, I'm more in the Chuck Rosenberg camp that this might not be as drastic as it seems, because unlawful behavior is still unlawful behavior, right? You could still, I think what Justice Roberts was saying, Chief Justice Roberts was saying is, if a president ordered SEAL Team 6 to engage in an assassination, that's unlawful and remains unlawful. However, where critics like Barb and Rachel and others are right to point out is it might be unlawful, but under yesterday's ruling, there's really no evidence you could enter into as a prosecutor that says the president engaged in this type of behavior, because of that small portion of the decision that says any behavior that's determined to be part of an official act. And we're seeing it in New York today, where Trump's lawyer said any communication, even if it was to Michael Cohen or about a porn star or about behavior that occurred before the presidency, any communication of Donald Trump as president is in the outer shadows of the office and can't be used as evidence. That's the most restrictive part of this decision that would suggest a bad actor could engage in unlawful behavior as president and actually get away with it. That is the hardest part to reconcile here. And I think it's what you heard Joe Biden say last night. As he said, he would never abuse this office, but Donald Trump certainly would, and that makes November that much more important.
Well, I ran into Chuck Rosenberg yesterday, and I said, my only thought or reaction to that analysis is that we have someone with a blueprint for doing things that are illegal that's running as a criminal. I mean, Trump has a record, as Carol and other investigative journalists chronicled, of recoiling against people at DOJ who he didn't view as loyal to him. He fires Comey because he doesn't see to it to let Mike Flynn go. He makes Sessions cry because he recuses from the Russia case. What is he afraid of in all these interactions? Criminal scrutiny. That's it. That's the whole ball game. He hands out pardons to people who he wants to commit crimes for him or who did retroactively. So I guess the SEAL Team 6 maybe, I don't find it particularly far-fetched, since they were they were chanting "Hang Mike Pence" and he cheered them on. But I mean, the reporting that I asked Carol about, where he wanted the Insurrection Act invoked, that was to use any means necessary to suppress protests after the murder of George Floyd. I feel like the thoughtful legal analysis almost doesn't recognize the brazen and public nature of Trump's extrajudicial ambitions.
Nicolle, you're exactly right about something because of this. You mentioned in the lead, the example, and Carol's reporting is that Don McGahn stopped Donald Trump from doing that. Don McGahn's not going to be in the next White House. Rudy Giuliani will be the next type of White House counsel who will not put the brakes on a President Trump.
Carol Leonnig, I want to give you the last word. What are your thoughts as you watch, our politics as topsy-turvy as they've ever been? The White House briefing was described to me as a feeding frenzy. I didn't catch it. We're going to speak to a White House official in the next block. The Supreme Court seemingly completely unmoored from precedent, tradition, and even traditional conservative stuff. And Donald Trump seeming to evade accountability at every turn.
In one respect, Nicolle, this is exactly what I expected the Supreme Court ruling would be, with a few small nuance differences, but absolute immunity for official acts is what I was watching come down the train track. And yet seeing it today and yesterday aligned with President Biden's faltering appearance in the debates, watching people call for him to step down or at least remove himself from this race. At the same time, Donald Trump, who showed himself to not treat the office with any reverence or real focused concern on his duty to the public and to the Constitution, seeing all these things circle at the same time is worrisome. As a young journalist, one of the things that I remember my mentors teaching me over and over again was, when you're reporting on public officials, what you're trying to figure out is your bar is not, are they engaged in a crime? Your bar for reporting important stories is, are they meeting the high standards that we expect for public officials who will serve the public? And right now, it feels as though a lot of our institutions are so below that bar. We are writing and reporting on things that are momentous and disturbing. And it's so far afield from my early days of holding people to account to the highest possible standard. We have a president right now who's struggling to show that he can lead for another 4 years. We have an incoming front runner for re-election who is planning to wage war against his enemies, against anyone who's disloyal to him, not the standard for serving the public and the Constitution that I was trained to report on from the earliest days.
It's an extraordinary perspective, and I feel like we could do a whole hour on sort of how the Overton window, right, has moved so drastically. We used to cover, the best and who's better than the best, and we are certainly looking at something that voters feel is pretty different. Carol Leonnig, Barbara McQuade, thank you so much for starting us off. David Jolly sticks around when we come back. More on the Supreme Court's dangerous ruling and what it says about the future of presidential power. We'll be joined by a member of President Joe Biden's White House counsel's office just ahead. Plus, an attempt by the ex-president to test just how far above the law he really is this morning. He woke up and asked if the ruling means his 34-count felony conviction in New York could be thrown away. The judge in the case with a surprising decision on that late this afternoon. And later in the broadcast, the alarm bells are going off as we learn more about the ultra-conservative figures working with Donald Trump to sketch out a policy plan to reshape the federal government should he prevail in the November election. It's called Project 2025, and their vision for America should worry every last American. All those stories and more with Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
It really is difficult to overstate what a dangerous precedent they have set, how they have essentially unshackled the presidency to commit crimes. The court really, without mincing words, has told the American people a president of the United States is fully authorized to commit crime. It is simple as that. I'm usually an optimistic person, but it is hard not to see this as a dangerous precedent that will haunt us. And I would not be surprised if the Roberts Court is one day termed the infamous Roberts Court for this decision, among others.
Let's bring into our coverage senior advisor and spokesperson for White House counsel's office, the Biden presidency. Ian Sams is with us outside the White House. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Nicolle.
Just tell me, in your view, sort of speaking on behalf of the people whose job it is to be the lawyers, not just for the president, but for the office of the presidency. What is your view and what is their view of the impact of yesterday's decision?
Well, as the president spoke to last night, it sets a truly dangerous precedent for our country's future. And the president came out and spoke so forcefully because he feels deeply, passionately that this was the wrong decision. Just like we've seen wrong decisions in recent years on fundamental freedoms for Americans, like we saw when Roe was overturned. This is a watershed moment for our country and for our democracy. And I think the president put it really clearly when he talked about the wisdom, the character, and the judgment that is necessary to sit in the most powerful office in the land. These are things I think we overlook sometimes when we talk about politics and the presidential politics. I think that people need to think hard about the type of person who sits in that chair every day. And for 3 years now, we've seen the president display extraordinary wisdom, judgment, and character when making consequential decisions about how to use his power. What has he used his power for? He's used his power to eliminate student debt for millions of Americans. He used his power to get significant bipartisan progress in the legislature done. These are the things that he does with his power. Those are the things that presidents should do with their power. And what we do every day, and what I have a front row seat to the amazing professionals in the White House counsel's office, is we make sure that the president is using that power for good for the American people. And President Biden said last night, people don't have to worry about him abusing this power. People know that he has the wisdom, character, and judgment to do this job the right way. He's done it for the last 3.5 years. But he's also alarmed for our democracy that the courts would say that that's the only constraint that exists on a president's power, is just hoping you have someone who has the character, wisdom, and judgment to do the job. That is an alarming shift from the court, and it's something that he felt really passionately about speaking out about.
I mean, Ian, it's a point that my colleague Chris Hayes made last night, and even if you peek over at Fox, no one picked up the decision yesterday and worried about anything President Joe Biden would do. All the coverage was about what it meant for Trump. How does that message get out to every last voter when it's sort of wrapped in this? I mean, at the beginning of the process, I had to study up on presidential immunity. How is that communicated in a way that all the voters really appreciate?
Well, we have to speak about it. I mean, I think that this is part of why the president felt so strongly yesterday when he was coming back from Camp David. I have to speak to this. I need to tell the country how I feel about this and to explain what's at stake for our democracy right now in this moment. We come out on shows like yours and talk about it, and, I'm sure content trickles across the internet. But we have to just keep pushing that message over and over and over again so that the American people can understand that this is a president who, over the last 3.5 years, has demonstrated the right wisdom and the right judgment and the right character when the toughest pressure of the most powerful office in the land is on you. That's the kind of person that he is. I think people lose this a little bit when they think about the president. We get wrapped up in the news of the day. But at the end of the day, for 3.5 years, this president has sat in the hardest job in the land and displayed the kind of wisdom you want from a president. And when it comes to the issues that they're making tough decisions on, he's not making decisions about himself. He's making decisions about how to help the American people with his power, how to get them better access to health care, how to expand their voting rights, how to protect them from gun violence. These are the kinds of decisions he has to make about how to use his power. And those are the decisions that he has been making about how to use his power. So when people think about how this decision impacts them and their daily lives, you have to think about how someone with the most power in the world is using the authority that they have, using the power that they have. And with President Biden, as you've seen for the last 3.5 years, he's used his power to try to make progress for the American people, to try to help their lives get better. That's how he uses his power, and no one has to worry about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a word people used to use about conservative justices. I think you're describing restraint. Listen, you brought up news of the day, so I'm just going to go there. About an hour ago, the New York Times moved a story that starts this way. You're all living it, so you probably know it better than I do. Quote, in the weeks and months before President Biden's politically devastating performance on the debate stage in Atlanta, several current and former officials and others who encountered him behind closed doors noticed that he increasingly appeared confused or listless or would lose the thread of conversations. Have you ever heard any accounts like that or witnessed that?
No, I've got to say that doesn't look anything like the president that I know. When I deal with him, he's sharp, he's asking tough questions, and he's speaking, I think maybe most importantly, speaking passionately about what matters to him. Yesterday, when he gives the speech about what the Supreme Court did, he drove that speech. He was at Camp David, and he came back earlier so that he could speak to the American people about just how strongly he feels about this decision and how wrong it was. That's the President Biden that so many of us experience every single day. Someone who's asking the tough questions so that we as staff can be sharp to do our job best for the American people and to help him make the best decisions for the American people, and how he's executing, like we've talked about during this segment, the powers of the presidency. That's the President Biden that we experience every day. He admitted that last week he had a bad night, he said in his remarks on Friday, he doesn't speak as smoothly as he used to. But the important thing is about the decisions that the president makes and how you do the job. The best predictor of how a president is going to be president is based on what the president has done. And you think about the way that he's displayed extremely strong wisdom and judgment over the last 3.5 years. You think of the way he's brought the world together against autocratic threats around the world. I mean, those are the things that he has brought to the Oval Office to help restore American leadership and to try to help, bring some normalcy back to this country.
You don't have to persuade me. I sat across from him exactly a year ago. I think it was a year ago on Friday. But could you acknowledge that there is a crisis, a political crisis among some of your own allies on Capitol Hill? At least one Democratic lawmaker calling for him to step aside, not for any of the reasons you just said. I think everyone agrees he's governed not just effectively, but in a historically successful manner. And I saw what you described when I sat across from him on my own set. It was an honor and a privilege. But there is great concern politically among your own allies after last Thursday's debate. Is that something you are helping to contend with or can acknowledge?
Well, I just want to say, working for the White House counsel's office, I'm smart enough to understand that there's something called the Hatch Act. And I'm standing here at the White House, and I want to be very careful not to talk about the politics. But what I can say more broadly is, the president this week is going to sit down with George Stephanopoulos for an interview. We announced that today. He's going to sit down, talk with him. The whole thing's going to air this weekend. He's talking to members of Congress. He's talking to governors. He's traveling across. He went and did an event about the extreme weather that this country is seeing right now. He's going to do a medal ceremony tomorrow. The president's going to continue talking to people, explaining to the country the job that he's doing as president and the things that motivate him and drive him every single day. So the president's just going to be out there. He's going to talk to people, and he's going to listen to them, and he's going to explain what the job he's doing as president and why he's the right person with the right character, wisdom, and judgment for the job.
I appreciate that. I think our viewers do as well, and I appreciate you being here today. You are always welcome. I'd be happy to have this conversation with you any day you'd like. Ian Sams, thank you very much for joining us today and fielding our questions.
Thank you.
David Jolly, let me bring you into the conversation. I mean, I've been a White House advisor. I don't know that you can ask much more from, especially someone on the White House side. And it is also true that there is I read to him from the story, a pretty deeply reported story with 4 bylines and at least 6 sources describing some things that are troubling, not because they don't happen to just about anybody, especially anybody 81 years old, but because when stitched together with what the whole country saw last Thursday, they create concern not around the ability to govern, but around the ability to prevail on November 2nd.
Yeah, Nicolle, look, there is a political crisis. There's no question about that. And I think everybody saw last Thursday, but the question is, in the days since, has the White House staff or campaign staff done what it takes to heal that crisis? And the answer is no. To suggest that it was just a bad debate night falls flat with millions of Americans who say, no, that wasn't a bad debate night. That was something else, but I don't know what it was because I don't have enough information. Was it simply an age-related moment? Was it a fitness moment? Or was there something else? And for the campaign staff of the White House to say, no, you didn't see anything. Just breathe through your nose and settle down and vote for us. That's falling flat. The one person who can get this White House back on steady ground is Joe Biden himself by doing what Ian suggested he's going to do. Do the sit down with Stephanopoulos. Let the American people see your strength and ability to govern. Look, the questions that came out of last week are pretty simple to compartmentalize. One is Joe Biden able to be president and govern right now? Absolutely he is. Look at his success at home and abroad, his ability to restore credibility to the White House and to our national standing on the world stage. He can absolutely govern right now. Can he govern for the next 4 years? The most impactful statement since Thursday was not from staff. It was from Joe Biden. He said, trust me, I wouldn't ask you to support me for the next 4 years if I didn't think I could do it. That's the Joe Biden the American people want to see. Now, can he win in November? That's a campaign question for Democrats to figure out. Is Joe Biden our guy still going into November that can stop Trumpism? He did it once. That's their case. Or is there another candidate? I'm not a Democrat. I don't have a voice in that conversation. The White House staff wants you to think, put your head down and go for it. The only advice I would offer is the Biden coalition is not just Democratic super voters who will follow you in lockstep with that strategy of just put your head down. The Biden coalition includes a lot of Americans who haven't performed as Democrats until 18 and 20 and 22, and they want the reason to stay with Biden in 24. I suspect you'll hear Joe Biden try to offer that reason again to Stephanopoulos and in other appearances he makes in the coming days.
Well, and David Jolly, the Supreme Court seems to be trying to help him. I mean, Republicans ran campaigns against the Supreme Court for years. Joe Biden could just as effectively be running against the Supreme Court. They're completely out of control. He's not planning anything radical to alienate the Biden coalition. I sat across from him a year ago and said, are you going to pack the court? He said, no way, never. Yeah. I mean, there's something so unique about not just temperamentally moderate, but politically moderate that seems, I understand where everyone's coming from. And I'm a never Trumper, so I will vote for whomever the Democratic coalition. I'm sort of a guest in the House is how I feel personally. Yeah. And it pains me when people think that you and I are somehow disrespecting this president. We turn into the other side if we don't tell the truth about what we see and hear. And I had a White House official tell me, I'm not going to spin what you saw with your own eyes and heard with your own ears. So I wonder how you are sort of thinking through these difficult days.
Yeah. Because you went there. And I agree. Look, I'm not a Democrat. I don't know your affiliation. I don't have a voice in who's the nominee. There is a large part of the Biden coalition with unanswered questions today, and the Democratic campaign operatives ignore that part of the coalition to their own peril, but they want a reason to stick with Joe Biden. They are people that would never vote for Donald Trump. But coming out of Thursday, it was not a bad debate. It was, as Nancy Pelosi said, an episode. Nancy Pelosi, who realized her time has come to step back. Jim Clyburn realized his time has come to step back. The question is, for the American people, is our president serving today, our president, capable and fit and able to be our president for 4 more years? If the answer to that question is yes, not simply because we hate Trump, but because we care about the capabilities of the chief executive of the United States of America. If he is capable, that coalition stands and Joe Biden beats Donald Trump. If you tell that coalition, just vote for Joe Biden and put your head in the sand, you're going to lose this race. They're losing it now by sending out that message. This can be corrected. Joe Biden's the man that can do it, and I expect he will.
Oh, me too. Me too. I'm looking forward to seeing him with George, who's a pro. All right, David Jolly, thank you for keeping it real. I don't know what else we do at this point. I really appreciate you. More fallout from the Supreme Court's historically terrifying immunity ruling yesterday. Donald Trump moving to have his guilty conviction in New York thrown out, starting with next week's sentencing hearing, which has been delayed until the fall. We'll talk about what Judge Juan Merchan can do next in the case when we come back.
Saturday, September 7th, Brooklyn, New York. It's MSNBC Live Democracy 2024, our premier live audience event. Maddow, Psaki, Mitchell, Reed, Hayes, Steele, Menendez, Sanders-Townsend, O'Donnell, Wagner, Rule, Melber, Kornacki, and more. Join the MSNBC community in conversation. Visit msnbc.com/democracy2024 to buy your tickets today.
A U.S. senator destroyed by blackmail.
He was not bound by the truth or by facts.
The country's most outrageous political demagogue ascending toward the peak of American power.
Millions upon millions of devoted followers.
This is a story of heroes willing to face down tyranny and the risk to the country if they fail.
Rachel Maddow presents Ultra, Season 2 of the chart-topping original podcast. Listen now on Spotify.
So picture this scene. In February of 2017, 1 month into his presidency, I'm visiting President Trump in the Oval Office for the first time, and it's truly awe-inspiring. He's showing me all around and pointing to different paintings, and he says to me something to the effect of, "Don't worry, Michael, your January and February reimbursement checks are coming." They were FedExed from New York, and it takes a while for that to get through the White House system. As he promised, I received the first check for the reimbursement of $70,000 not long thereafter.
Who among us is surprised that after yesterday, the ex-president is now building a case to argue that his newfound complete immunity means he cannot be convicted for criminal conduct that took place while he was sitting on a chair in the Oval Office? Like the thing he did that Michael Cohen describes here, writing checks for reimbursements for hush money paid to an adult film actress and then concealing them, lying about them as legal expenses, the thing he was convicted of 34 felony counts for. Well, having some success, this afternoon, Judge Juan Merchan agreed to delay Donald Trump's sentencing that was scheduled for next Thursday in the Manhattan case until at the earliest September 18th, which would now put it after the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention, and it would land about a month and a half before the presidential election. Donald Trump's lawyers asked for time to file a motion to get his 34-count guilty verdict thrown out, citing the Supreme Court's ruling on presidential immunity. It would be an argument prosecutors say without merit, that in the meantime has clearly set up another delay in Trump's pre-election legal challenges. Joining our conversation, New York Times investigative reporter Susanne Craig, an MSNBC legal analyst and a former criminal division deputy chief at the Southern District of New York, Kristy Greenberg, is back. Susanne Craig, it feels like a million lifetimes ago that we sat every day together at 4 and covered this trial. But you had a feeling when the Supreme Court handed down absolute immunity for President Trump, it was a case brought by President Trump, that everything had changed. And when I saw the news this morning about the New York case, it is clear that that is also Trump's view, that everything has changed.
Right. And the hush money case where he's now facing a sentencing, most of it involved his conduct in 2016 prior to him taking office. But there were a number of things that happened at the White House that are now going to come under a new light. And I think, like everybody today, I made a list of all of those things. I probably didn't get them all, but there was a lot of conduct that did spill over into the White House. You played the tape of Michael Cohen, and that was one where the checks were signed and they had a discussion about the checks coming. That was just one. And the other one I think was really important was that conversation that he had with Hope Hicks, where they were talking about Michael Cohen and the payment, and Donald Trump said, well, it's better it comes out now than prior to the election. And that was a conversation that happened at the White House. Some other ones I wrote down, there were tweets involving Michael Cohen, there was call logs, there was conversations that he had in the White House, there were speeches, there was a public disclosure form that he had to make where he disclosed the payment to Michael Cohen. And then there was that famous April 2018 press conference right aboard Air Force One, where he denied knowing about the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels. I'm sure I have missed some, and we don't know, I guess, but you can't imagine all these are going to fall under official conduct. But I can assure you that Donald Trump's lawyers made the same list and are going to be going through it and are going to be making a very from their point of view, a very strong case to the judge that a lot of this should fall under official conduct and that the verdict should be set aside.
Kristy, I've said on the show that I really, if I'd known I was going to cover someone like Donald Trump, I would have sought to obtain a law degree in some manner. But tell me how I know all those things, I know where they happened, but how is it anything official to have sex in Tahoe with Stormy Daniels and then engage in collusion with David Pecker and then pay Michael Cohen fake, falsely accounted monies to keep Stormy Daniels quiet? Which part of the conduct is official?
So none of what you just said would be considered official. I completely agree with you. But I do think, as Sue was going through that list, that is a list where at least some of those acts could be considered official. The one that I focused on was the same one that Sue mentioned, that witness testimony with Hope Hicks in 2018 when she was the White House communications director. And they were talking about how it is, for example, that the Stormy Daniels story was playing. Under this opinion from the Supreme Court, they could say that discussion between Donald Trump, then president, and his advisor constitutes an official act. And then use of any evidence pertaining to an official act, even though the charges are completely related to unofficial acts, any use of evidence pertaining to the official act should not have been admitted at this trial. So you're going to see the prosecutors and Donald Trump's lawyers going through each of these potential acts, whether they're official or not, with a fine-tooth comb. And then if they are official acts and they shouldn't have been admitted, then the question becomes, well, how important was this evidence? Was it really significant? Like that Hope Hicks testimony, that moment was significant, but was it cumulative? For example, we heard similar testimony from David Pecker saying that he had a conversation with Donald Trump about the fact that he was happy that the Karen McDougal story didn't come out. And that happened in the White House. Well, David Pecker is not a White House advisor. David Pecker is a private party, so that's arguably not official. So you're going to look at these, are they official acts? And then if they are, did it really make or break the case? Or was it something where there was just so much evidence in this case that is not something you can point to and say, we throw out the whole thing? And so given just how much strong evidence they had, I really don't think this is going to change the game, but it is going to take some time, and the judge and the parties are going to be really combing through this record carefully to see if there's any evidence that would make a difference.
Sue, it is an extraordinary delay. Everything about the calendar this year is extraordinary, and it's been rescheduled for mid-September. Do you have any sense or any reporting that holds, or does that feel pretty loosely placed on the calendar?
I just think we don't know. I mean, something could bump it again. I mean, this is now we're getting into justice delayed territory. I didn't think that the July 11th date was going to move, but this certainly is just, it's just recast everything. So I don't think we know, but it is significant because whatever happens, this is the first criminal conviction of a former president. That sentencing was going to go ahead next week. And now it's moved into September, just weeks before this immensely consequential election. And it could get moved again. We just don't know. It's going to be a crazy fall. I think we're going to be talking a lot.
It's going to be a crazy fall. I feel like that should be the T-shirt, and that's all that we should wear. And that might be my new mantra. Susanne, Craig, Kristy Greenberg, if nothing else, it is a pleasure to see both your faces again. Thank you so much for being here. We have to work in a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. If it's Tuesday, there's more bad news for Rudy Giuliani. The disgraced New York City mayor and Trump ally, former attorney Rudy Giuliani, was officially disbarred in the state of New York today after his law license was suspended in 2021 for his role in spreading lies about the 2020 election on behalf of Donald Trump. The appellate court writing this, quote, "The seriousness of Giuliani's misconduct cannot be overstated. He not only deliberately violated some of the most fundamental tenets of the legal profession, but he also actively contributed to the national strife that has followed the 2020 presidential election, for which he is entirely unrepentant." Giuliani is also facing charges in Georgia and Arizona and is an unindicted co-conspirator in Jack Smith's federal election interference case. He owes $148 million to the two Georgia poll workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. He had his radio show on WABC canceled after being suspended by that network for continuing to lie about the 2020 election. Up next for us, Project 2025 is not a game. The growing warnings about what Republican extremists are planning for the federal government should Donald Trump prevail in the November election. Much more news to come. Don't go anywhere.
Saturday, September 7th, Brooklyn, New York. It's MSNBC Live Democracy 2024, our premier live audience event. Maddow, Psaki, Mitchell, Reed, Hayes, Steele, Menendez, Sanders-Townsend, O'Donnell, Wagner, Rule, Melber, Kornacki, and more. Join the MSNBC community in conversation. Visit msnbc.com/democracy2024 to buy your tickets today. Go beyond the headlines with the new MSNBC app. Get real-time analysis from live blogs to in-depth essays, video highlights from your favorite shows, and the latest updates on the 2024 election. Visit msnbc.com/app to download.
Time for us to play chess, not checkers. It's about making decisions that will affect us as human beings, our careers, our next generations to come. Did you know that it is now a crime to be homeless? Pay attention. It's not a secret. Look it up. They are attacking our most vulnerable citizens. The Project 2025 plan is not a game. Look it up.
Oh, I love that she did that. Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in the East. No, it's not a game, and this is not a drill. Project 2025 is their plan. It is serious. It's in writing. It's public. It is a chilling approach to running our federal government that got all the more chilling after the Supreme Court granted Donald Trump absolute immunity. It's the plan that Trump would implement on day one should he prevail in the November election and end up back in the Oval Office. That was actress Taraji P. Henson delivering that warning during Sunday's BET Awards to make sure that her audience and all Americans wake up about what is truly at stake this November. A full-scale reimagining of our entire system of government and who runs it in Donald Trump's image and vision. The mission statement for Project 2025 is a plan assembled by the Heritage Foundation. Sounds like something you'd read on the ex-president's Truth Social feed, and there's no evidence to rebut that that's exactly where it came from. Quote, "It is not enough for conservatives to win elections. If we are going to rescue the country from the grip of the radical left, we need both a governing agenda and the right people in place, ready to carry this agenda out on day one of the next conservative administration." Axios has new reporting on what they describe as Trump's imperial presidency in waiting, writing this, quote, "Trump promises an unabashedly imperial presidency, one that would turn the Justice Department against critics, deport millions of people in the U.S. illegally, slap 10% tariffs on thousands of products, fire perhaps tens of thousands of government staff deemed insufficiently loyal. He'd stretch the powers of the presidency in ways not seen in our lifetime. He says this consistently and clearly, so it is not conjecture." A few other headlines from Project 2025's 900-page plus mandate, putting Christianity at the center of American life and government. Criminalizing the mailing of abortion medication, the most common form of abortion care, criminalizing sending that through the mail. Taking the word abortion out of all laws, policies, and regulations, as well as terms relating to gender and sexual identity. Removing protections for the environment, denying climate change, eliminating the Department of Education. As the New Republic called it a few months back, quote, "a remarkably detailed guide to turning the United States into a fascist paradise." And now, after yesterday's seismic ruling from the Supreme Court, that an American president has immunity for all official acts, there is legally no limit to what Trump will do and can do. It's where we start the hour. It's where we'll start this hour every day, as long as there is news to share on this front with our favorite experts and friends. Writer and editor for Protect Democracy, Amanda Carpenter, is here. President of Media Matters for America, Angelo Carusone, is here. Former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama, Ben Rhodes, is here. And Democratic strategist and professor at Columbia University, MSNBC political analyst Basil Smikle is here. Amanda Carpenter, I start with you. It's taken the media a minute. We're behind the great Taraji P. Henson. But I think that the Supreme Court decision has focused the minds of the media, I hope. We're going to try to get through a lot of it. It's about 600 pages long. But tell us what you first sort of seized upon. I know you've been looking at Project 2025 for a long time.
Yeah, and I have. And I also think it's important to show how it's directly tied to the Trump campaign agenda, because I think it's almost too easy for Trump to dismiss it by saying, oh, that's an outside group. And so what I did through my work at Protect Democracy with my wonderful colleagues was put together this resource called the Authoritarian Playbook 2025. And you can find that at authoritarianplaybook2025.org, that talks through the systematic ways that the Trump campaign agenda overlaps and collaborates with Project 2025 in distinct ways that would dismantle our democracy. And that sounds like really exaggerated, but it is not. And so we went through and really tried to explain in a factual, no nonsense way about how this goes down. And we divided it up to several areas. The first has to do with how Trump will consolidate power to direct investigations against his enemies. There's a lot of material that, policy wise, the Project 2025 agenda lays out how they will systematically do that. That allows his loyalists to engage in lots of regulatory retaliation, putting the tariffs against his enemies, things that he really experimented with in his first term and trying to double the shipping rates of Amazon to punish Jeff Bezos. That clears the decks for that kind of stuff. And so that's where things you'll hear about Schedule F and these purges of civil servants come into play, because they're going to need a lot of people to do that. And Project 2025 has a big job resource bank to vet people to be ready to go on day one. But probably the most alarming things have to do with consolidation of power at the military. We're talking about federal law enforcement overreach when Trump says something that he thinks that shoplifters should be shot on the spot. And then policy-wise, he promised to indemnify law enforcement who overreaches so that they cannot be held accountable. You talk about the domestic deployment of the military, abuse of the Insurrection Act, and you couple all this with an unfettered pardon power, which he's already shown that he has a penchant to abuse in the ways that he's already pardoned his political loyalists and allies. And so this all adds up in the end game, which is always the authoritarian end game, is that they don't leave, right? Because once you consolidate all this power, you can't give it up. And so that's where this always goes. So if people want to check that out, we really did our best to distill it in a clear, easy, factual explanation, because if you look at Project 2025, it is a lot to go through. So let's look about where this intersects, get really focused on the ways that our democracy will be threatened, because that's the quickest way we can get to some solutions in terms of maybe, putting some more guardrails in place when it comes to Congress. Because, Nicolle, I think we've learned from this process, we can't keep banking everything on the next election and the next presidency. People have to get to work and get creative now.
Well, what is the solution other than making sure that Trump is never president again and can't put this into action, Amanda?
Well, for starters, I think we've seen the slide of SCOTUS supersizing the presidency for quite some time. And obviously, this immunity ruling is a wake-up call. I think this is to be a time for, Democrats in Congress to really get smart and savvy about reining in executive power before it's too late. I understand that legislation probably can't be passed right now, but this is a good time to start building the case for it. Instead of freaking out about what's going to happen to the presidency, use the power that you have now to build that message, to talk to people, to get solutions. Because I don't want to come off as lecturing as like a Republican that's on here saying Democrats need to do more. But it is my feeling now that MAGA is on the rise, just simply because they're out working everybody on a lot of fronts. Yes, the courts have let us down, the Republican Party has let us down, but they are not stopping. And so I think we need a lot less panicking and a lot more working.
Yeah, I mean, Ben, there is this thing. I described it to David Jolly in the last hour as, I am a guest in the Democratic coalition. I don't plan on leaving. I'm like the House guest that won't leave. But there is this sense that Republicans with the most malevolent and malignant leader and the most rotten set of enablers have done too much damage. I mean, who is the Democratic Leonard Leo? Who is the writing the pro-democracy Project 2020? And I actually asked 5 people. I got 5 different answers. 1 is the Constitution. 2 is whitehouse.gov. Who is sort of sitting in the quarterback chair to give Joe Biden's vast pro-democracy agenda its marching orders to try to push back against what is, malevolent and malignant are the only words I can come up with to describe Trump's plan for a second term.
Yeah, I think you're right to focus on the question, Nicolle, and I'm going to get to it. I just want to make one point about Project 2025 that builds on your point about parties, which is sometimes we make the mistake of just thinking, this is just Trump and Trump's going to come in and somehow this is all emanating from his own interests. When in fact, if you look at that Supreme Court decision, that's the result of decades of court packing by the far right and a relentless focus on the courts, such that we really have no solution right now in the near term for dealing with a 6-3 majority that is changing the Constitution before our very eyes. And so I think we have, first of all, have to make a change now we think about this. It's not just Trump. Trump obviously is the most corrosive force on the party itself, but he's connecting with the worst elements in the party that have been building this authoritarian playbook for some time. And we've seen this, as you and I have talked about, in other countries. In terms of who's pushing back, I would point to the necessity of taking action, not just at the federal level, because you pointed out in your last question, it's difficult. If Trump wins and the Democrats don't control both houses of Congress, well, we'd be dealing with an out-of-control president and a Supreme Court giving him a blank check. Some of the fortification you have to do and some of the groundwork you have to do is at the local and state level. And this has been the case in other countries that have had to try to create antibodies to resist authoritarianism. I think some of the more innovative democratic policy work, both around democracy and around solutions that matter in people's lives, are happening across the country in different states and municipalities. In the first Trump presidency, frankly, his decision just to take climate change, which is one of the examples you used from Project 2025, his decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement did not have that big of an impact in terms of American emissions because a lot of states, California leading them, built their own guardrails around the capacity of the federal government to undo their actions. And so I think part of what the Democratic Party needs to do is not just have a kind of top-down thing where we're waiting for the next presidential election every 4 years with bated breath, although we have to do that, particularly in the next few months. But we need to be building from the bottom up in the same way that the Republican Party has. What are we doing at city levels, at town levels, at state levels? What are we doing with grassroots mobilization? The Democratic Party, Nicolle, has a lot of infrastructure. I've been a part of that infrastructure. It's not always connected to each other. Sometimes it's disconnected. Mm-hmm. There's an environmental movement. There's a movement for reproductive freedom. There's a movement for LGBT rights. This all needs to be woven together in the same way that the right-wing coalitions have been. And so we need that kind of collective effort in everything that we're doing, not just for this election, but frankly, it's going to take a generation just to undo what's already been done. And never mind if Trump gets back in there again.
Ben, as you're explaining that to me, I think I know why. The Republican project is about power and a corrupt pursuit of power, which is very unifying. The Democratic project, I don't even think Democrats see it that way, is around these benevolent causes, right? And you can debate. Amanda and I were in the Republican Party when we just debated how to keep the water clean. Now the Republican Party's, Trump said it at the beginning, the water will be the cleanest water ever. He literally has not one policy to make water clean. Water doesn't just become clean because you say it so. But I think you're getting at this structural underpinning and the lack of any coordinated political response to what is a complete hostile takeover, not just of institutions in the court, but of the very democracy. And my question is an uncomfortable one, but is it too late?
Well, it can't be too late. I think we are too late in a lot of ways, in the sense that this has been going on for a long time now, and we've been trying to beat it back in every election, every 2 years. But I do think you've seen progress in recent years. Again, from the bottom up, but also with the kind of people getting elected to office, right? The kind of people who are in their 40s and 30s who get moving into elective office. What I would say, Nicolle, just to build on what I was saying before about how the party functions, it tends to be a collection of different interest groups, right? Who are, understandably focused on the issue they care about. You're right that the Republican Party has been focused on power. Look, the Koch brothers did this, where they would gather a bunch of donors together, and they'd say, don't donate to the things you care about, the issues you care about. Let's put all this money, pool it together, and use it to win power. And then the things that you care about are going to be taken care of on the back end here. I think Democrats need to mobilize collectively in that fashion so that we realize that ultimately winning elections across the country and building support and pipelines for the kinds of policies that defend democracy and defend the kind of groups that are going to be targeted by Project 2025 is what is so essential here. It's going to take not just the kind of playbook that the Democratic Party has been using for the last 30 years. It takes a new kind of mindset that I think has been building in the Trump years. It really has. But we're at a moment of truth here now, first in this election, but then in realizing just how deep the hole is that we're in. And that Supreme Court decision pointed up the depth of the hole that we are in, because that is a 6-3 majority that is likely to be with us for a while. Okay, so it's going to take not just kind of, everybody giving their best effort through the next election. It's going to take organization in the long term.
Angelo, I know you've been looking at Project 2025. Why do you think it's taken the media so long to focus on it? It's all right there out in the open. These plans, they're extrajudicial. They're an extraordinary abuse of power. They're the sorts of things that the Trump's first White House lawyers would have warned him against doing. And they're all here on the website in black and white.
I think two reasons. One is that it's so big. It's hard in the media. You have to sort of identify what's the story. It's a short segment. There are very few programs and shows and outlets that will sort of delve into that kind of complexity. And then I think the second part is is that the internalization that it's a real threat, right? Because the right wing, as in your previous conversation, it's all sort of acknowledged it. They've been doing this forever. They've been doing this for decades. Right? They always organize and coordinate and collaborate, and their institutions do that. They always sort of have these plans. In the first Trump administration, the Heritage Foundation says that 64% of all of the policies that the Trump administration put into effect in their first year were the result of the work of just the Heritage Foundation alone. So part of it is that it feels like, is this different? And I think now with the Supreme Court decision, it's provided a lens to say, wait, some of it seems much more likely to be been achieved.
I lost you. I need you to say that part again after the Supreme Court decision, because I agree with you. I think the Supreme Court decision is this window to focus everybody on what exactly they said, how radical it is. Everything they said before yesterday was, to quote Bill Barr, bullshit. They had no respect for precedent. They had no respect for the things they'd said in their own confirmation hearings. They also couldn't give a single example of any president that had ever been, reined in from doing what they described as bold things. And yet they gave this ex-president, absolute immunity.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, to me, that is the focal point, is that it provides a lens for the media, for the public to say, wait a minute, these plans, which seem fantastic, which seem illegal, maybe the checks or the guardrails we thought we had in place that would make them, that just sort of, it was to make it no longer just fuel for sort of right-wing media, but actually become something that we all have to deal with. It seems much more likely now as a result of that Supreme Court decision, because what they basically did was take away, at best, a lot of assumptions that people had. I mean, even Mitch McConnell had the assumption that there were things that the president does that are illegal. Because when he said, look, I'm not supporting impeachment here because there's a criminal justice system that could take care of Donald Trump if he had done illegal stuff in the last few weeks of his administration to try to steal an election. I mean, everybody had those assumptions. And what that Supreme Court decision did, at best, put aside whether or not there's new law and the implications of it, what it did do was take away an assumption that many people had about one of the few last remaining guardrails. And to put a bow on it, and I think it sort of ties in the significance of this election in a lot of ways in this moment, this is the first election in 30 years where Rush Limbaugh is not the single largest get-out-the-vote operation in this country. And so when we talk about all the institutional power and organizing that happened on the right, we also can't disconnect that from the fact that they've been pumping poison into the information ecosystem for decades and building generations of ditto heads, of individuals that are not just going to take an amplification imperative and repeat right-wing misinformation, but feel that they also have an obligation to act on it. And it is being called. And what that decision does is call that question.
Basil, Ruth Ben-Ghiat said something really important yesterday. She said that despair and hopelessness are two vital tools of the autocrat. That what they need is for people to feel that all is lost, to feel hopeless. Because I always ask experts, are you still optimistic? And they say what Ben just said. I can't be. I am. I can't feel despair and hopelessness. I have to be optimistic. One, are you optimistic? And two, where do you derive your optimism from if you are?
That's a great question, because I have to tell you, in the last few days, particularly with all this conversation post-debate, I've been very angry. And I've tried not to let that anger turn into frustration and worry. But the reality is it has. I talk to friends and colleagues, and they have similar concerns, which is why I was so thankful to see Taraji P. Henson at the BET Awards really call the 2020 Project 2025 to call it out for what it is. It was the biggest night for the culture, and to speak to the culture about threats to that culture in real time, I think was extraordinary, because it came off of a day when Donald Trump talked about black jobs. And when he talks about black jobs, it's not just the slip of the tongue. He's talking about jobs that are focused on servitude, bereft of any substance or intelligence, because that's not who he thinks we are. So our black job is not servitude, it's actually civic engagement. And that's what gives me hope. It's seeing people who perhaps never would have taken the position that they did on a stage like that, in public like that, all of a sudden turning around and saying, no, I've got to speak out about this. And the urgency is critical. Because as everybody's talked about Project 2025, with a point that I feel really does need to be hammered home, is that it is an agency by agency instruction booklet for Donald Trump if he were to ever get to office. And it is not a 10-year plan. It is a 180-day plan. 180 days. That's not enough time to throw up a protest. That's not enough time to legislate. That is not enough time to take something to court. It is designed as a steamroller so that Donald Trump could do everything he wants to do as well, thanks to the Supreme Court, on day one. So what we should be talking to each other about is not just about an existential threat to our children and grandchildren. It's what are you going to do in the next 6 months. Because come January, if Donald Trump is president, our lives will change radically. And I need us to all be on the same page about that. And I'll just say this very quick about Ben's points related to the party, because this keeps me up at night. For a decade or more, a lot of individuals have actually run against the Democratic Party, not really fully embracing it, but against it, and have started many organizations that are well-meaning and do really good work, perhaps really innovative work. But to his point, a lot of it is not stitched together. And when you convince a lot of voters that the party is not responsive to you, they therefore are not going to use the party as a vehicle for the political and economic empowerment that I saw it for when I got involved 30 plus years ago. When you combine that with the decline of religiosity, the fact that you have places where we used to congregate like churches, and so many Black churches in Harlem and New York City are closing down, that the civic engagement in many ways has been small d democratized because of social media. There is now this increased need to make sure that we are in the room talking with each other, sharing our plans and setting a course forward. Because as I said, this is not a 10-year plan that the Heritage Foundation is creating the intellectual foundation for. It's not a 10-year plan that the business community is flocking around Trump to fund. It's 180 days starting in January.
Well, I've been sifting through it since Thursday myself, Basil, and you guys have just given me my first super dose of hope in a long time. And we will, for our part, turn over. And we've got with Angelo, we've got lots of time. we don't look for 2-minute segments. They're not long enough. We need 20-minute segments. I actually have to sneak in a break first, but we'll try to do some of that work here. No one's going anywhere. There's much more to get to. I want to show you what Trump's own person in charge of the people is saying about how this would work and what this would look like should Trump prevail in November. Plus, Lordy, there are more tapes, many more tapes, and we've got them. We'll play them for you later in the broadcast, all thanks to the journalist who sat down with the disgraced, convicted ex-president half a dozen times after he lost re-election. Ramin Setoodeh is back with those never-before-heard clips and audio tapes, including why Trump, in his imagination, thinks he actually won the New York civil fraud trial, which he lost bigly. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
So the number one thing is being aligned with the agenda. The second would be competency, being able to actually work in the environment. And experience doesn't matter quite as much because there's a lot of junior roles as well. And sometimes experience is bad, but it's more about just being able to do the job. And the number one thing actually to see a job through is not caving to media pressure, because if you're in an important role, they are going to come after you. It's only a matter of time.
We're back with Amanda, Angelo, Ben, and Basil. Amanda, I've watched that a few times. Every time I see it, I fight with myself over what the most startling thing is that he says. I used to think it was loyalty is more important than experience because experience can be bad. But this time, the way I heard his point about media is more, don't believe what you see, don't believe what you hear. We need people who can stay the course, even if the press is covering the policy as extrajudicial. What do you understand from looking at this plan from what John McEntee is saying?
A lot of the mythology that Project 2025 is based on is that Trump was stymied by this deep state that was out to get him from day one of his presidency. And if you look at the specific cases where they think that Trump was sabotaged or the deep state lashed out against him, what you actually see are Republican handpicked appointees who told him no for some reason, in some policy area because they believed it would violate the Constitution or to go against their own oaths of office. We're talking about when he asked if he could shoot people at the border, and Department of Homeland Security officials said no. We're talking about when he leaned on the Department of Justice to drum up a sham investigation so that he could stay in power, and Bill Barr said no. We're talking about when he held up aid for Ukraine, and people in Congress started saying, where did the aid for Ukraine go? And people started looking into it. And so those are the problems problems, I put in air quotes, that Project 2025 seeks to solve by vetting people not for expertise, but for loyalty to the president. I mean, this whole project rests on the idea that we have to get rid of the deep state that was out to get him. But also, when Donald Trump says, I have Article 2 power to do whatever I want, they're finding a way to make that true, hand in hand with the Supreme Court. And that is why they're so laser focused by these things like Schedule F, which would allow the president to unilaterally reclassify thousands of federal workers to get them out so that they could get their loyalist, non-expert people in who essentially will never tell the president no. That's what this all rests upon.
And the Supreme Court figures in Ben Rhodes because the court yesterday reaffirmed the absolute nature of his pardon power and his absolute immunity for official acts, which is how they would couch all of this. I mean, the other thing that pulls the Supreme Court into this story in a pretty central way is that the gentleman in the clip we came in on, his name is John McEntee. One of the people who gave John McEntee a list of names was Ginny Thomas. So it is all on the right, a single project.
Yeah, and we have to see it that way. And if you think about the Supreme Court and what they've been doing the last few years, they have basically taken the position that they are there to service the interests of Donald Trump and the right wing of the Republican Party. And they are no longer in any way playing the role that the Supreme Court has at times played in American history, where they're kind of a last guardrail for rights for individuals. Why do I say that? When I hear that clip, you know what I think about Nicolle when he talks about media? I think about the separation of families. You had Trump try to institute a policy separating children from their families at the border, and you had a huge media backlash to that. And the people in the administration kind of backed off that at the time. I actually think that's what he's referring to, because what we know is Trump is going to come first, as the BET clip powerfully made the point. He's going to come first for vulnerable people. So if you try to envision a scenario not that far from now, less than a year from now, where he's trying to put millions of people in this country into camps, or he's trying to mass deport people, including people who've been here for decades, whose children were born here, whose spouses live here, there'll be a media backlash. And what I hear in that clip is him saying, we need people in there who are not going to get rattled if there's a kind of wall-to-wall media coverage talking about how outrageous this is. We've got the Supreme Court. We know that the Supreme Court is not going to stand in the way of something like a mass deportation scheme or an internment camp scheme. The last thing we need is just people who are willing to sit there in those jobs and put up with a lot of people in the media getting very outraged about what's happening. And that's what they want to do. And again, it'll start for vulnerable people who don't have protections anymore because they don't have protections from the courts. But it'll come for anybody that Trump deems an enemy. And if he's able to do this also at the intelligence community level and at the military level, well, then we're talking about generational damage done to the American state and the extension of his personal interests with no check from the Supreme Court in ways that, we're going to bring up scenarios that we can envision. Again, General Milley, another guy, he probably didn't like the media backlash to when Trump marched across Lafayette Square and they cleared those protesters with tear gas. That's the kind of person he doesn't want as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff next time. So that's what I hear when he talks about media pressure. People who have no shame. They cannot be shamed out of doing the things Donald Trump wants them to do, and they won't be stopped by the Supreme Court.
This conversation won't be stopped either. I find it wildly optimistic that you envision media backlash. I mean, that's a set of assumptions as well that I'm going to cling to, at least tonight. Amanda Carpenter, Angelo, Carusone, Ben Rhodes, Basil, Smikle, to be continued. Consider yourselves on notice. We need you for this. When we come back, another batch of very revealing audio tapes of the convicted felon ex-president talking to Variety's Ramin Setoodeh. He's back with more clips for us, never before been heard, of Donald Trump in his own very troubling, very bizarre words. It's next. It's hard to articulate this, but let's try this. It's a side of Donald Trump that is different from the one he projects out into the public, to the world. A version, if you will, of the convicted felon, disgraced ex-president. Same bluster, same rapid-fire lies, but even less varnished, if that makes sense. We're talking about what Trump is like away from the crowds and in front of a journalist and a tape recorder, when his filter, as limited as it is, dissolves completely. And it's not just what he says, but how he says it. Over the past few weeks, author, journalist Ramin Setoodeh has been sharing with us remarkable, new, never heard before tape recordings from a half a dozen sit-down interviews he did with the disgraced ex-president after he lost, the former Apprentice host, like this one. Tapes that cut to the very core of who Donald Trump really actually is.
So if I went back to NBC right now to do something, they would do anything I wanted to do. Show business, I'm talking about. Doing a show, anything I wanted to do right now, 100%. Because one thing I know about that business, and I learned that business better than anybody else can learn a business in a short period of time, it's all about one thing, ratings. If you have ratings, you can be the meanest, most horrible human being in the world. There's only one thing that matters, ratings. You can be nice or you can be mean. You can be evil, you can be horrible, you can be crude or elegant. There's only one thing that matters, and that's ratings. If you don't have ratings, it doesn't matter.
That the word elegant is in his vocabulary is the part of it that I can never unhear. Let's bring in now the aforementioned writer and journalist Ramin Setoodeh, Variety co-editor-in-chief, author of Apprentice in Wonderland, How Donald Trump and Mark Burnett Took America Through the Looking Glass. It's so great to have you back. It's so great to listen to more of these tapes. The book is amazing, but the interviews on which the book is based are just still stun. Take me inside these clips that you've brought us today.
Thank you so much, Nicolle. Thank you so much for all your support for my book. The clip that we just heard was actually in a conversation that we had on November 13th of last year. It was the day that Donald Trump's sister died. I was at Mar-a-Lago with him, and I was talking to him about whether or not NBC, there was a path for him to go back to The Apprentice on NBC. And he argued that there was. And what was interesting, because my book looks at Donald Trump through the lens of reality TV and how he's a reality TV star, is that he continued to pose this hypothetical and this sense that he was somehow being wooed to come back to TV, even though I found no evidence of that. And that's the TV star in him. He wants people to see him as a TV star, a successful TV star. And that's the philosophy, and that's the way in which he views the world. And that's how he governs, if you can call it governing.
What's amazing is that there's no evidence that that's ever been true. And Newsmax, which is more dystopian, more foxy than even Fox, runs Trump with a disclaimer. I mean, why? Where in his brain does he think that NBC is secretly, privately, unbeknownst to anybody in the real world, pursuing him for a new show?
Because he always sees the world through the lens of being renewed. And I think that he thinks, because The Apprentice in his head was such a successful show, and it was successful in the early seasons, but certainly not in the later seasons, that somehow NBC has this beef with him, and they're upset that because he ran for president, he stopped being host of The Apprentice.
Let me play this tape. I set this up for me. This is him attacking the judge in the civil fraud trial. Tell us a little bit about what we're about to hear.
So on this day, there was a lot going on. His sister had passed away, but also Don Jr. had resumed to take the stand in the civil fraud trial, where he was talking about how wonderful his father is and how great his father is at business. And in the middle of our conversation, Donald Trump received a phone call where he asked for a directed verdict and then tried to offer his own analysis of what was happening in New York while he was in Florida.
Okay, let's listen.
Let me give it a shot, okay? All right. So they just finished up the trial. We won everything. We have a judge who just doesn't want to let it go. He's crazy. I don't know if you're liberal or not, but this guy is a radical left lunatic.
Yeah, he's very liberal, and he's not a supporter of yours.
He's a political hack.
Yeah.
He's a real hack. When you look at him, he should have never had the case in the first place. He got it. A very dangerous system. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like very dangerous. The good news is we're killing him. He's getting horrible publicity.
Yeah, I saw that.
Horrible. This thing with his weightlifting and shit, he's crazy. He's a lunatic. Yeah. And he doesn't want to let it go.
So he's talking about Judge Goron, is that right?
Correct, yes.
What does he think he won? He lost everything.
And no verdict had been announced at that time. So it was very confusing when he told me that he'd won, because clearly the trial was still ongoing. But I think in his head, again, looking through the prism of reality TV, everything is about headlines and being able to spin the press. And so these negative stories that had appeared about the judge, which I think he may probably have had something to do with, or someone on his team had something to do with, that had been leaked about the weightlifting, and Trump seemed to know very clearly what had been written about the judge. And as a result of that, he thought he was winning because the judge had bad publicity, and Donald Trump was he was rejoicing over that. He was excited about that.
Let me play what he had to say about this very network, MSNBC.
But at the top, they're very bad people because they're very dishonest. MSDNC is a very dishonest show, right? MSNBC, but it's I just call it. Deface the nation. I have good names. Deface. Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump on Deface, right? Deface. They go crazy when I say it. But anyway, I thought that NBC would be, to me, like nobody else. Like nobody else. And they're absolutely atrocious. And especially through MSNBC. And the reason is that I made them a fortune. People have said that if I didn't come along with you, they had no top 10 shows, they had no anything, they were dying. Jeff Zucker, I made that guy because he got lucky.
This is so revealing and so disturbing on every level. Explain.
It is, because Donald Trump lives in this delusional world in which he is the star, right? He's the A-list star, and he's the center of the universe. And one of the things that was so disturbing to me watching the debate on Thursday was because of Joe Biden's performance, we didn't get to see the real Donald Trump, right? He retreated, he kind of held back. And Trump is very skilled. He's gone into the boardroom, and when someone's self-imploding or self-destructing, and I could see it in Donald Trump's eyes, he could see that he didn't need to do much. And so he held back, and we didn't get to see the real Donald Trump. But I have spent a lot of time with the former president, and this is who he is. He lives in a fantasy land. He thinks he's the biggest star in the world, and he thinks that NBC needs him, and they've betrayed him by not covering him favorably. He does think he's a king. He doesn't think he's a politician that has to play by the rules like everyone else.
That's fascinating debate analysis, some of the most astute that I've heard. What do you think he thinks happened at the Supreme Court yesterday?
I think that he now thinks he has a free pass to do whatever he wants. And what's so scary about this is that in the time I spent with him, he has so many feuds. It's not just Hillary Clinton and Jim Comey. It's Deborah Messing from Will and Grace. It's Martha Stewart. It's Arnold Schwarzenegger. These feuds live in his head, and he's constantly fighting in his head with these people that he feels like betrayed him. And if he's able to go after every single person that's on his enemies list, this is going to be a very scary administration.
Ramin, you thanked us. We thank you. It's an incredibly enlightening and illuminating series of interviews. Thank you for sharing more of them with us. The book is called Apprentice in Wonderland, How Donald Trump and Mark Burnett Took America Through the Looking Glass. Truly must read. Ahead, one of the star witnesses to come out of Donald Trump's hush money trial, Stormy Daniels, in an exclusive sit-down interview with my friend and colleague Rachel Maddow, speaking out for the very first time about what scares her now that the trial is over. The very first look at that new interview is next. Thanks to the John Roberts Court and its absolute immunity decision for Donald Trump has been given the green light to do what he said he was going to do when he launched his campaign, seek out retribution against his already very long list of perceived and real enemies. That list is, as we said, lengthy. It would be hard to list everyone who's on it. But near the top of the list are those people who were involved in helping to secure the guilty count on all 34 of those felonies he was charged with in New York in the election interference hush money trial. They include key trial witness Stormy Daniels, who was at the other end, who received the hush money payments. In her first U.S. interview since Trump's guilty verdict, Stormy Daniels sat down with my colleague Rachel Maddow and talked about what she's faced in the wake of that conviction. It's not just potential revenge from the ex-president and convicted felon she's facing, but also violent threats for her role in holding Trump accountable. Here's some of that brand new exclusive interview.
When the gag order was in place, did you benefit from that at all? Are you worried about it being lifted? No, I mean, he's going to say what he's going to say anyway.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of what he could say about me or what he could call me. I'm telling the truth. I'm the only one that has continued to tell the truth. I can prove everything that I've ever said. So I'm not concerned about those things he might say.
Yeah.
I'm concerned of him saying something that will make his followers come after me more.
Has that changed over time, the character of the way people have come after you, the kind of language? How has it changed over time?
The biggest thing is that they're not hiding. They used to all be bots.
Oh.
Now they're using their real stuff. There's, Facebook threads from people in my own community planning to do things to my house and my family.
Disturbing, vitally important, and you can watch the whole thing. Rachel's exclusive full interview with Stormy Daniels tonight at 9 p.m. during a special 2-hour edition of the Rachel Maddow Show right here on MSNBC. Another break for us. We'll be right back.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. My fellow citizens, we have come now to a time of testing. We must not fail.
That was 60 years ago today. President Lyndon B. Johnson, surrounded by lawmakers from both parties, as well as civil rights leaders, to sign the 1964 Civil Rights Act into law, the most important piece of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. In a statement celebrating this anniversary today, President Joe Biden says this, quote, "It is still the task of our time to build a democracy where every American is treated with dignity and has an equal opportunity to follow their dreams. We must continue to move forward together, stand with one another, and choose democracy over autocracy and beloved community over chaos. We must choose to be believers, dreamers, and doers." Isn't that nice? We can still do hard things, right? Thank you for letting us into your homes during these truly extraordinary and, yes, difficult times. We are grateful.
Saturday, September 7th, it's MSNBC Live Democracy 2024, our premier live audience event with your favorite MSNBC hosts. Visit msnbc.com/democracy2024 to buy your tickets.